So this morning on an airfield in Ankara, Turkey, we witnessed the biggest international exchange of prisoners since the Cold War.
That's Shane Harris, who covers intelligence and national security for The Post. And he is one of many reporters in our newsroom covering this landmark event, a high-stakes negotiation that led to a swap of at least 24 people.
This was a long-awaited for moment which saw ultimately freed people who had been held in Russia for many years in exchange for some people held in the United States, Germany, and elsewhere whom the Russian government wanted back very badly. So this massive prisoner swap played out on this airfield. Various prisoners got onto different planes and flew to freedom this morning.
What it took to get to this moment, as you'll hear from Shane, is honestly pretty extraordinary.
For years, the United States has been trying to win the release of a number of Americans who officials say are unjustly held in Russia. They include a man named Paul Whelan, who has been in custody for more than 5 years, imprisoned in Russia, accused on baseless charges of espionage.
Under heavy guard in the courtroom, Paul Whelan continued to insist on his innocence, even as a panel of 3 judges sentenced him to 16 years in a prison labor camp.
People like Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter who listeners probably have heard has been in Russia for more than a year.
Russian security officials claim that Evan Gershkovich, who works for the Wall Street Journal, was trying to obtain classified information.
And Vladimir Kara-Murza, a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist and contributor to the Washington Post, who is very outspoken in his opposition of Vladimir Putin's government.
He was convicted for treason and spreading misinformation after he criticized Russia's war in Ukraine.
These were really high-profile people who had been held unjustly, and in various fits and starts and in plans that looked like they were about to come together and then fell apart at the last minute, the United States has been working quietly behind the scenes trying to negotiate with Russia an exchange. So today is the fruition of a very long and delicate process that we were never completely sure we were actually going to see.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Thursday, August 1st. And earlier today, President Biden spoke from the White House about this historic prisoner swap.
Well, good afternoon. And this is a very good afternoon. A very good afternoon. Today, we're bringing home Paul, Evan, also Vladimir. 3 American citizens and 1 American green card holder. All 4 have been imprisoned unjustly in Russia. Paul for nearly 6 years. Vladimir since 2022. Evan since March of 2023. And also since October of 2023.
Today, we'll hear more about how Biden approached the decision to negotiate this prisoner swap and what the U.S. gave up to make it happen. And we're going to be talking to Shane, who has some incredible reporting about the backstory of how this all unfolded in the final hours. So Shane, before we get into the logistics of the swap, I do really just want to hear from you. What was your reaction when you first heard that this prisoner exchange was about to happen? Because I know what my reaction was. And, of course, one of the people who's part of this swap is journalist Evan Gershkovich, as you said, from the Wall Street Journal, who is someone that many of our colleagues know, many of our friends know. And that, to me, is why this news felt like a jaw-dropping moment. For you, what were you thinking?
Yeah, I learned on Tuesday that this prisoner exchange, this deal, was basically about to happen. And my first reaction was just incredible relief. I've been covering Paul Whelan's imprisonment pretty much since he was arrested years ago in Moscow. And, of course, I've been very closely following the case of Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter. And he had been working in Russia and was arrested on suspicion of obtaining secrets about the Russian military on behalf of the American government. But essentially, the Russians accused him of being a spy, and he became the first U.S. journalist taken into custody and accused of spying in Russia since the height of the Cold War. So these were tactics that we just had not seen in quite some time, extremely harsh, like I said, trumped-up charges. And Evan was essentially imprisoned for the crime of committing journalism.
Before he was detained in Russia, did you know Evan at all?
I didn't know Evan, but I worked at the Wall Street Journal before I came to the Post, and I followed the campaign to get him freed.
Journalism is not a crime.
Journalism is not a crime.
Journalism is not a crime.
Good afternoon. My name's Emma Tucker, and I'm here to kick off this readathon for Evan.
Hello, I'm David Muir from ABC.
I heard the statements that his colleagues and his family put out. His sister Danielle gave interviews on behalf of the family.
My family, we're advocates for Evan every day. We also rely so much on the incredible journalist community, everyone who has been helping in whatever way they can, whether it's reporting about Evan, sharing the hashtag on social media, I Stand With Evan, the Wall Street Journal.
And, as journalists especially, we're kind of all part of a tribe. And so Evan's case really resonated with many of us. I remember that the day he was arrested, and I think like a lot of people in our profession, it really kind of sent a chill through me because I think we had presumed that, an American journalist working in Russia for a big-name national, international newspaper was probably safe. And this clearly showed us that he wasn't. The people who are being held there, particularly Paul Whelan, who's been held for so long, have undergone sham trials. They've been sent to prisons in desperate conditions. Some of them had thought they were going to be able to come home in previous swaps, only to find out that they were not included. So I was pretty choked up, to be honest, when I found out that this was happening. And the thing that really stunned me was the scale of it. It was very clear that this was not going to be a one-for-one kind of swap like some of the ones we've seen in the past, but a really big one that was going to involve a lot of people coming out of Russia, including names that many of us are not familiar with, people who are political dissidents who have been in Russia fighting for a democracy who were put in prison. So the scale of it was also just really impressive, and it was a very exciting story. It was my birthday when I found out, so I considered it a gift.
So Shane, as you said, this is the biggest prisoner exchange basically since the Cold War. What do we know about how this prisoner exchange happened, how it was negotiated?
So this negotiation involved months of conversations by people in the Biden administration, at the State Department, in the White House, at the CIA, and in the intelligence community, up to and including the level of the president himself speaking with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. So really, to understand how we got here, you have to go back to a different deal that was on the table earlier this year in February, when the United States was trying to get back Evan Gershkovich and Paul Whelan from Russia. And they were also trying to work out a deal that would free Alexei Navalny, who was this very prominent critic, of course, of Vladimir Putin and an opposition party leader who had been imprisoned in Russia. And they thought that this would be particularly appealing to Germany, which had imprisoned a man named Vadim Krasikov, who the Russians very much wanted to see returned to Russia. Krasikov is a key person in this story. He is a Russian intelligence operative who in 2019, acting on behalf of a Russian intelligence agency, assassinated a former Chechen fighter in Germany. He gunned him down in broad daylight in the middle of a park in Berlin. It was an incredibly brazen attack. Germany, the court that convicted him, labeled it an act of state terrorism. Russia wanted this guy back. Berlin did not want to do that. I mean, freeing a murderer, someone who had killed on German soil, was just seen as untenable. But the United States thought that perhaps freeing Navalny in exchange for Krasikov would be something that the Germans could get behind. And ultimately, there was a deal to make this happen, but then suddenly Navalny dies under mysterious circumstances, and the deal falls apart. So officials in the U.S. have to go back to the drawing board and essentially come up with a new list of people who the Germans might find palatable, someone that they would be willing to trade for Krasikov. And what they come up with, actually, in the United States, is a list of people that includes allies of Alexei Navalny, as well as other pro-democracy advocates in Russia who had been imprisoned. And those people are among the ones that we saw released today in exchange for this man, Krasikov, who is now on his way back to Russia.
Yeah, so you mentioned the names Evan Gershkovich from the Wall Street Journal, Paul Whelan, but also there are other countries involved in this. Which are those other countries? And can you describe some of these other hostages who were freed as part of this?
Sure. So there are 12 German nationals and Russian political prisoners who are going to go back to Germany. Now, some of these people were people who had worked closely with Alexei Navalny when he was alive. There are also people who Russia wants back who are being held in other countries, including Slovenia, Norway, and Poland. These are people, some of whom have been convicted of crimes and are being held in those countries. So these other nations had to be involved in the negotiation and essentially agreeing to let those people go back to Russia. There were heavy negotiations with Slovenia, actually. President Biden himself actually had to get on the phone, we're told, recently and talk to the Slovenian prime minister, his counterpart, and persuade him to stay with the deal and make sure everything was on the table. Later that morning, the president sent a letter to the American people saying he would not be running for office. So he was talking to the prime minister of Slovenia on the day that he publicly announced he was not going to seek re-election.
Wow,
so
that all of this is happening behind the scenes.
All of this is happening behind the scenes, yeah.
And so then when it comes to today and how that swap actually played out, describe to me, like, how did they get these people out of Russia? How did the swap happen?
There were little signs of it if you knew where to look. So really beginning last Sunday, reports started surfacing that some of these political prisoners, who are not extremely well known in the United States, but are well known to the pro-democracy community, had, without explanation, been removed from the jails and the prisons where they were being held and were being taken to some undetermined location. Later, we saw reports that folks like Paul Whelan and Vladimir Kara-Murza also had been removed from their detention centers. And that was a signal that something was afoot, that these prisoners were being moved out of a location and taken somewhere else. Amateur plane spotters actually started noting that Russian government aircraft, including some used by Vladimir Putin himself, were flying to different parts of the country where some of these people were held. And it looked like everyone was being gathered up to be taken to Moscow. These were all signs that something might be afoot in the way of a prisoner exchange. So as we understand it, all of these individuals, and there are 16 of them in total that were coming out of Russia, are taken to Moscow. They were put on a plane and flown to Ankara, Turkey, where they landed morning Washington time. And other planes carrying other prisoners that were going to be part of this exchange all kind of convene in Ankara. And it's there that this swap actually happens. So you're talking about people getting off the planes, going onto other planes that will take them back to their countries, or in some cases to the United States. We understand that the prisoners were checked by medics to make sure that they were okay. There has to be a physical identification of some of these people. So, people like Evan Gershkovich and Vladimir Kara-Murza, very recognizable. Some of these individuals who are German nationals and activists who are imprisoned, there's not even pictures of some of these people. So there's got to be an effort to make sure that they're there. And one reason that's really important, and U.S. officials in conversations stressed this, was until they had confirmed that every one of the people who was supposed to be part of the deal was there on that tarmac, the deal was not finalized. And it raised this really difficult question of, well, what do you do if you get there and you find someone's missing? What if two of the activists are gone? Like, what if Evan Gershkovich for some reason is not there? What do you do?
But according to our reporting, were there any stumbling blocks like that?
We haven't seen any, and there was no particular reason to think that this wouldn't go off as planned. But administration officials and folks I talked to in recent days were, as they put it, on pins and needles waiting for this to happen. But there were just really tense moments in our newsroom, in government agencies around Washington, all around the world, really, as people were monitoring the path of the flight that we had determined was probably the one carrying these prisoners. A number of news outlets had agreed to embargo information that we were receiving from our sources about this hostage exchange, this prisoner exchange, up until the point that it was clear that the plane had arrived from Moscow. All the other prisoners were in Turkey and had been accounted for and were safely out of harm's way. So essentially waiting until these hostages were actually free of Russian custody and were flying either back to the United States or to Germany. And as the planes were in the air, we saw some news organizations beginning to report that this hostage swap was underway, this prisoner swap was underway. And I think that this is really important because while we all want to break news, and we knew that this swap was coming, we could not be sure if Evan Gershkovich or Paul Whelan or all of the people who Russia had promised were actually on that plane that was flying from Moscow to Turkey. Once they land in Turkey, they're not home free. They have to be accounted for. They have to then be transferred into other countries' custody. So there was real anxiety among sources who we had all been talking to that this deal could fall apart on the tarmac.
After the break, we'll hear what this complicated prisoner exchange means for Biden and for Vladimir Putin. We'll be right back. So, Shane, we heard earlier President Biden's remarks about the prisoner swap today. What else has struck you about how his administration has navigated or spoken about this exchange and the stakes of it all?
They have said that it is the biggest and most complicated that there has been since the Cold War.
The deal that made this possible was a feat of diplomacy and friendship. Multiple countries helped get this done. They joined the difficult, complex negotiations at my request. And I personally thank them all again. And I've thanked them personally, and I'll thank them again.
They are very cognizant of the risk that this poses, I think, of encouraging Russia to capture more civilians, more Americans, more innocent people and imprison them. But they also believe that it was very important to do everything that they could to get all of these people home. And we should note that not every American is coming home. Notably, Mark Fogel, a school teacher who's been imprisoned in Russia, who was arrested with medical cannabis in his possession, he is not part of this deal. We don't exactly know why. That will be devastating, no doubt, for his family.
Yeah.
But administration officials said they're going to still work to try and get him out. But, I think it's safe to say that Biden administration officials are very, very happy about this. This is a huge exchange. I think it's something that President Biden personally wanted to get done. We know from reporting that when he found out that Navalny had died and this deal was basically, had fallen apart, he directed his team, keep at this, find another way, figure something out to get these people back. He has met at the White House with the families. He has spoken to relatives. He has given them tours of the White House when they visit. One of the things that is so fascinating about hostage exchanges or negotiations for prisoners is it requires leaders at the very highest level to be involved. You don't release people, convicted felons, from American jails to send back to Russia without the president giving it his okay. And presidents, and this has been true in other cases too, become often very personally invested in the fates of these people. I think back to when President Reagan was in office and there were a number of American citizens being held in the Middle East by terrorist groups associated with Hezbollah. Mm-hmm. And President Reagan met with those families. He directed his staff to do whatever they could to bring them back. This gives you a real sense of when it comes to the fate of people being held abroad.
Like how invested presidents can be in those moments.
Yes. Presidents can become very emotionally invested. And it is this wonderful window, I think, because it blends both policy, this is very high stakes policy, you're setting precedent in some cases, with personality, with emotion. And a president has to be able to hold those both.
Well, let me ask this. Obviously, that's the case for President Biden, and this is going to be an immense point of pride for him, though, to be clear, he's also going to get a lot of pushback from Republicans who will likely say that this was not a deal worth making. But what about Russian President Vladimir Putin? Like, what has the Russian government said about this prisoner swap? And what does this mean for them to have successfully negotiated freeing a lot of people that they really wanted to get back?
I think that Vladimir Putin will portray this as a win for him and for Russia. And, I think it is a win for Vladimir Putin because he is getting back this individual, Vadim Krasikov, who he sees as having essentially served in the patriotic interests of Russia. There have been prisoner swaps before that Putin has very joyously celebrated. A number of years ago when this group of undercover Russian operatives known as the Illegals was rounded up and eventually swapped in an exchange involving the U.S. and Russia, Putin greeted them as if they were returning heroes. They were celebrating, singing Soviet-era songs together.
Wow.
This is like spy swaps are very much, I think, in the imagination of Putin, who himself is a former KGB officer. He has clearly learned that he can take people prisoner and negotiate with the West to get back people that he wants. If we go back to one of the previous really high-profile exchanges people will remember, Brittany Griner, the basketball player who was arrested in Russia and was swapped for a man named Victor Bout, who is a notorious arms merchant.
The 55-year-old has been dubbed the Merchant of Death and the Sanctions Buster for his ability to get around arms embargoes. For almost 2 decades, Bout became the world's most notorious arms dealer, selling weapons to rogue states, rebel groups and murderous warlords in Africa, Asia and South America.
Somebody who Putin had wanted for a long time, a very big fish, a lot bigger than Krasikov. And he got him, arguably by, taking a woman prisoner and a famous person at that. So Putin, I think, has really learned a lesson here that these kinds of prisoner taking, if you want to call them, many of these people are very much in prison on trumped up charges, we should say, it works if what his aim is to get people freed from the West.
Yeah. Well, I think that speaks to what a lot of people will pick up on here, which is, frankly, like the profound imbalance in the types of prisoners who are being swapped here. Brittany Griner is a great example. You have a basketball player being swapped for a notorious arms merchant. I think if you look at Evan Gershkovich, arrested for essentially doing his job at being a journalist, versus this person that he's being traded for who is a convicted murderer, I think people have questions about, is this worth it? Why are we giving up people who are so dangerous? And what does it mean that the U.S. and Germany and their allies are being left in this situation to have to pay a really high price to get people back?
I think what it tells you is that the leaders of the United States and Germany have made the determination that, as is distasteful as it is to swap, a convicted murderer for people who had no business being imprisoned, and as much as that creates a moral hazard, that Russia will simply turn around and take more innocent people prisoner, that it was more important to these individuals and to their families to win their freedom and to do whatever that took within the bounds of these negotiations. I think it's an incredibly hard call. I've covered hostage negotiations for years. I've gone back and studied them from the past. These things never have easy answers, and every administration that's dealt with this knows that they're having to wrestle with these contradictory impulses, and they're just creating incentives for more people to be taken hostage. There's the famous phrase, as the U.S. is often using, we don't negotiate with terrorists. Well, we have in the past, but we negotiate with people who take people unjustly. It does happen. And I think that, a lot of this really does come down to the emotions involved. I think when presidents meet with the families, with the children, with the spouses, with the parents of these people who are, wasting away in Russian prisons with probably very little idea what's actually going on outside in the outside world, that has an enormous effect on them. And, nobody likes having to do these deals, but, many administrations have made the determination that it's worth it because these people are innocent. They didn't do anything wrong, and they're suffering and caught in the middle of this big game between nations. I think also, it says something about, I think, the West's commitment to pro-democracy movements, frankly, that they were willing to try and negotiate to get so many of these activists freed and that they wanted to try to get Navalny out. There is arguably a big PR win, by the way, in doing that. I mean, certainly if they had succeeded in freeing Alexei Navalny, that would have been something that would have been celebrated by democracies.
And frankly, it's just such a heartbreaking concept to consider now that they were that close to getting him out before he died.
Yeah, absolutely. And we still don't know exactly why he died, and U.S. officials say they're not really sure. But it looked for a moment there like this whole thing would fall apart and that people like Paul Whelan and Vladimir Kara-Murza and Evan Gershkovich would just be stuck in prison indefinitely. But it is such an emotional enterprise when these things happen. I mean, in all the years that I've written about this, I've always thought to myself, if it were my father or my husband that were stuck in one of these places, I would want the U.S. government to move heaven and earth to get these people out.
Of course.
I've interviewed families of people who were held. They understand the political implications. That's not what's most important to them. They're not unimportant, but what they want is their loved one back. So you're really dealing with, this tug of war between the head and the heart when it comes to these negotiations. And everybody knows what the stakes are and everybody knows the precedents that it's going to set. But at the end of the day, these people get to go home.
Shane, thank you so much for unpacking all of this.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
Shane Harris is a national security reporter for The Post. Some of the released prisoners are expected to arrive later tonight at Joint Base Andrews, right outside of Washington, D.C. They are Evan Gershkovich, Paul Whelan, and Alsu Kurmasheva, another journalist released today. According to a national security official, President Biden and Vice President Harris plan to be there to greet them. Before you go, some updates from the Olympic Games in Paris. The United States is leading the medal count as of late Thursday afternoon with 37 total medals, though they're behind another country for the most gold medals. Right now, China is winning that count with 11. Yesterday, swimmer Katie Ledecky racked up the 8th gold medal of her career, finishing the women's 1,500-meter freestyle more than 10 seconds ahead of the silver medal winner. And today, she got silver in a team relay race. So she now has 13 Olympic medals in her collection, more than any other American female ever. And today, another legend, gymnast Simone Biles, won gold in the women's individual all-around final. Her American teammate Suni Lee won bronze. It's been a really exciting Olympics so far. I've been watching rugby, I've been watching tennis, I've even watched a little bit of dressage. And one way that I've been following what's going on behind the scenes in Paris is listening to our new pop-up podcast here at The Post, The Sports Moment. Today, they shared a story that I found really moving about what it's like for parents to watch their kid compete in the Olympics. And we wanted to play a little bit of that here. So you'll hear my colleague, Ava Wallace, who hosts The Sports Moment, along with other sports reporters from The Post. Ava brings us the story of those parents,
who I have run into myself. I've run into some swim parents. I've certainly seen some parents at other events. There's skateboarding families that I got to talk to. They're certainly an intense bunch, as they should be, because the thing about these Summer Olympics is they're the first one since 2016 where family members have been able to come here and cheer on their Olympians.
I would like the parents to be a little louder in some of this. I brought my cowbell. We have some horns, so I am probably one of the louder ones.
Laura Woodhead is the mother of water polo player Dylan Woodhead.
This was the first time when he walked up and we were like at the railing and we were like waving and he looked up and he waved.
Yeah. So, that must have been a great moment.
Yeah, it's like one of those moments that I'll always remember.
Mimi Hooper is the mother of another water polo player, Johnny Hooper.
It's an amazing feeling to actually be there because, for every family, the journey was long.
There's so many people that are part of this journey, like godmother, coaches. We have some high school friends here. I think what's so special is to be able to let them experience it, here with us.
Laura Woodhead remembered how weird it was watching her son on TV in Tokyo.
It was great to be home with everyone, grandparents and people who couldn't travel, But at one point, it kind of felt like a Netflix series where you're watching this movie. Like, I think he was there.
Last time, nobody was there for her.
Jim Husk, the father of swimmer Tori Husk, had to watch his daughter lose her race on TV in Tokyo.
I'll tell you, that look on her face in the last one was heartbreaking.
But this year, he was able to watch his daughter Tori win a gold medal, even though he was too far up in the stands to really see her face.
This was the exact opposite. It's the pinnacle because she's still crying, but it was different. This was for tears of joy. I'm glad we couldn't see her because we were so far away, because I would have lost it. And I lost it when I got home. I mean, I was crying a little. There's no way you can't. But when I got home and saw her emotions, it was like, oh, my God, you know. And so that was really nice. It was a great feeling to see redemption.
That story was brought to you by Ava Wallace, who is a sports writer for The Post. You also heard sports reporters Adam Kilgore and Rick Mace. Senior producer Ted Muldoon put that segment together for The Sports Moment, again, our new Olympics podcast. Now is a great time to start listening. You can find The Sports Moment wherever you listen to podcasts. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. Today's show was produced by Rennie Svirnovsky with help from Sabby Robinson and Emma Talkoff. It was mixed by Sam Baer and edited by Monica Campbell with help from Rena Flores. Thanks also to Jen Eamer and David Herzenhorn. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from the Washington Post.